A human engineer inherits the largest starship in the universe, but he freezes upon boarding. Every morning he woke up in his small apartment in the city, brewed his coffee, and walked to the orbital engineering lab where he worked. His life was orderly, predictable, and comfortably simple. He liked it that way. Machines had rules, numbers made sense. He knew that if a bolt was too tight or a circuit was misaligned, the problem could be fixed with patience, logic, and skill. People, however, were far more complicated, and Thomas preferred machines. They didn't judge, they didn't gossip, and they didn't expect much from him besides careful attention. Thomas was not a man who expected surprises. He had long accepted that his life would be uneventful, filled with technical problems to solve and late nights poring over schematics. Yet, on a Thursday morning, something happened that completely shattered the calm he had cultivated. He arrived at the lab to find an envelope waiting for him. It was unusually large, made of thick, cream-colored paper, and sealed with a wax emblem that he didn't recognize. Thomas frowned. Usually, communications from the company or his supervisors came via secure digital messages. He rarely received physical mail, especially something that looked so official. With a mixture of curiosity and caution, he broke the seal. Inside was a letter printed in an elegant font that seemed almost old-fashioned. It began with a greeting, "To Thomas Keller, rightful heir of the Celestial Titan." Thomas blinked. The Celestial Titan? He had never heard that name before. It sounded like the kind of thing in a science fiction novel, not real life. But as he continued reading, confusion turned into disbelief. The letter explained that Thomas had inherited the largest starship in the universe from his uncle, Adrian Keller, a man Thomas barely knew. Adrian had been a brilliant engineer, one of the first humans to travel beyond the outer planets and work on interstellar technology. He had been a legend in technical circles, known for designing starships so advanced that many people believed they were impossible. Yet Thomas had only met him once, when he was a child, and only remembered a kind face and an awkward handshake. The letter stated that Adrian had passed away peacefully a few weeks ago, leaving all of his personal and professional possessions to Thomas. Among these was the Celestial Titan, a ship larger than any other ever built, capable of carrying thousands of crew members, advanced laboratories, and enough supplies to explore distant galaxies. The letter went on to say that Thomas now had full ownership and responsibility for the vessel. Thomas read the letter multiple times, each word sinking in slowly. He felt as if he had stepped into a dream. His hands shook slightly, not from excitement, but from sheer disbelief. He had always been good with machines, yes, but this? This was not a machine he could fix in an afternoon or tinker with on weekends. This was a floating city, a world, a piece of the universe itself, and now it belonged to him. For hours, Thomas sat in his small apartment trying to process the news. His mind raced with questions. Why me? How could this be real? Am I ready for this? He thought about the engineering lab, his colleagues, and the small, comfortable life he had built. None of it seemed to matter anymore. The Celestial Titan was so immense, so beyond comprehension, that Thomas felt a cold knot of fear in his chest. The next day, he visited the office of Adrian Keller's estate. The building was quiet, filled with the kind of official smell that came from old wood and polished brass. Thomas met with a lawyer, an elderly woman with sharp eyes and a calm voice. She explained the details. The ship was registered to him officially, all legal claims had been settled, and the crew, though currently in standby mode, would soon report to him as their captain. Thomas's stomach tightened. Captain, me? The word sounded strange, almost alien. He was an engineer, someone who fixed things, not someone who led people. He had never commanded anyone, never given orders beyond technical instructions. The thought of thousands of crew members looking to him for guidance was terrifying. He walked through the corridors of the estate, staring at artifacts, photographs, and blueprints left behind by his uncle. Adrian's life had been extraordinary, filled with achievements that Thomas could barely comprehend. There were medals for exploration, photographs of distant planets, and holographic maps of star systems that humans had only recently begun to explore. Thomas felt both inspired and inadequate. How could he possibly live up to such a legacy? Back in his apartment that evening, Thomas stared out at the city lights and thought about the future. The Celestial Titan awaited him, orbiting in a distant docking bay, silent but enormous. Every technical manual and schematic he had ever studied seemed small in comparison. The thought of stepping aboard for the first time made his heart pound with anxiety. He imagined endless corridors, blinking control panels, massive engines that dwarfed his imagination, and a crew that expected him to know everything. Yet despite his fear, there was also a spark of curiosity. Thomas had always loved solving problems, and this, he realized, was the ultimate problem. The Celestial Titan was a challenge beyond anything he had faced before. It was vast, complex, and filled with unknowns. And somehow, deep down, he felt drawn to it, as if a part of him had been waiting for this moment his entire life. The following days were a blur. Thomas researched every detail he could find about the Celestial Titan. He studied Starship designs, propulsion systems, and life support networks. He read logs left by his uncle, trying to understand how the ship functioned and how it had been operated in the past. Every new piece of information made the ship seem larger, more alive, and more overwhelming. Despite all his preparation, Thomas could not shake a growing sense of unease. The ship was not just metal and circuits. It was a living ecosystem of technology, humans, and responsibility. He imagined standing on the bridge, looking out at the stars, with decisions that could affect hundreds of lives. It was more than he had ever imagined possible. On the day of his first visit to the docking bay, Thomas felt a mixture of excitement and dread. The platform was immense, surrounded by engineers and technicians who had worked on the ship for decades. They looked at him with expectation, as though they could see his thoughts. Thomas swallowed hard and stepped forward, trying to calm his nerves. When he finally saw the Celestial Titan in person, he froze. The ship was colossal, stretching far beyond anything he had ever seen. Its surface shimmered in the artificial lights of the docking bay, and massive engines rested like slumbering giants. The bridge towered above, filled with glass panels and blinking lights. Every detail of the ship was meticulously designed, and Thomas realized that every inch of it was a testament to his uncle's genius. Thomas felt a sudden weight pressing on his shoulders. This was no longer a distant inheritance or a story he had read about in a letter. This was real, and it was now his responsibility. He could not fix it like a broken machine in a lab. He could not simply turn a wrench and solve the problem. The Celestial Titan was alive in its own way, and it demanded more than technical skill. It demanded courage, leadership, and vision. For a long moment, Thomas stood there, staring at the ship. He felt a mixture of awe, fear, and excitement. The vastness of the universe seemed to press against him, and he realized that stepping onto the ship would change his life forever. He would no longer be just an engineer in a quiet lab. He would become the custodian of humanity's greatest achievement, the captain of a vessel that could journey to the stars. And yet, as he took the first tentative step toward the boarding ramp, Thomas felt a cold shiver run through him. The reality of what he had inherited was almost too much to bear. He was a simple man, unprepared for the enormity of this responsibility, and yet he could not turn back. Somewhere deep inside, he knew that he had been chosen for this moment, and that he would have to rise to the challenge, whether he felt ready or not. The Celestial Titan awaited him, vast, silent, and magnificent. And Thomas Keller, human engineer, was about to face the greatest challenge of his life. The morning air at the docking station was crisp and filled with the low hum of machinery. Thomas Keller arrived early, his hands deep in the pockets of his coat, feeling a nervous tension he could not shake. He had spent the past days reading everything he could find about the Celestial Titan, blueprints, logs, even old video recordings of the ship in operation. But no amount of preparation had eased the strange, gnawing fear inside him. As he walked toward the ship, a small group of people approached him. One of them stepped forward, a woman with calm, steady eyes and a posture that suggested experience and authority. She introduced herself as Alara, the operations officer assigned to guide Thomas until he could assume command. Her presence was reassuring, yet it also reminded him that the responsibility was real, immediate, and enormous. "Welcome, Mr. Keller," Alara said, her voice firm but kind. "The Celestial Titan is ready for your inspection. I'll be here to assist, but ultimately this is your ship now." Thomas nodded, swallowing hard. I know, his words faltered. How could he explain the mixture of awe, fear, and doubt that filled him? This ship was more than a machine. It was an entire universe contained within steel and circuits, and he was expected to take control of it. Alara seemed to sense his unease and gave a small, understanding smile. You don't have to do everything at once. Start small. Learn the basics, walk the decks, familiarize yourself with the systems. It's vast, yes, but you will find your rhythm. Thomas followed her toward the boarding ramp, each step heavy with the weight of expectation. The ramp itself was massive, stretching upward to meet the hull of the ship. It hummed faintly, the engines of the celestial Titan lying dormant but alive, like a great animal in slumber. He took a deep breath and stepped onto it. Immediately, the scale of the ship became overwhelming. The docking bay was enormous, but inside the ship, everything seemed infinitely larger. The corridors stretched farther than his eyes could see. Lights blinked in patterns he did not fully understand, and monitors displayed streams of data that seemed almost incomprehensible. Thomas felt his stomach tighten. He had studied Starship operations before, but nothing had prepared him for this. Ilara led him through the first few decks, pointing out critical systems, life support, navigation controls, power conduits, and engine cores. Every detail was intricate, precise, and daunting. Thomas tried to focus, taking notes and asking questions, but he could feel panic rising. The sheer complexity of the ship made him feel small, unworthy, and overwhelmed. At one point, he paused in front of a massive engine core, its surface smooth and shining, glowing faintly with residual energy. "I've never seen anything like this," he admitted, his voice almost a whisper. It's bigger than anything I've worked on before." Ilara placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You don't need to know everything at once. Start with one system, learn it, and move on to the next. The ship is designed to be manageable if approached step by step." They continued their tour, and Thomas was introduced to the crew members who had been stationed on the ship for maintenance. Engineers, technicians, and systems analysts looked at him with curiosity and cautious respect. Some whispered among themselves, wondering if the young engineer was truly capable of commanding the celestial Titan. Thomas felt their eyes like a pressure he could not measure. As the day wore on, Thomas found himself drawn to a small control room on one of the lower decks. The room was quiet, dimly lit, with a panoramic view of the docking bay. He could see the celestial Titan's engines in the distance, massive structures that seemed almost alive. Sitting down at the console, he realized how little he truly understood. The panels displayed a multitude of readings: power distribution, life support status, propulsion readiness, environmental conditions, and communication networks. Each system was complex and interconnected. A single misstep could have serious consequences. Thomas ran his fingers along the controls, almost instinctively. Despite the fear, a spark of curiosity ignited within him. He loved solving problems, and the ship was the ultimate puzzle. Every component, every subsystem, was an opportunity to test his skills, to explore the limits of his understanding. And yet, the weight of responsibility was immense. Thousands of lives depended on his ability to comprehend and manage this colossal vessel. Over the next few days, Thomas spent long hours walking the decks, reviewing systems, and talking with the crew. He asked countless questions, trying to understand everything from propulsion calibration to emergency protocols. Ilara guided him patiently, often encouraging him to take breaks, but Thomas rarely did. Sleep felt like a luxury he could not afford. One evening, as he stood on the observation deck overlooking the docking bay, Thomas reflected on how drastically his life had changed. Just a week ago, he had been a simple engineer, content with the predictable rhythm of his work on Earth. Now, he was the heir to the largest starship in the universe, with the knowledge that he would soon be responsible for navigating it through the uncharted reaches of space. He felt excitement, yes, but more than that, an overwhelming pressure that pressed down on him from all sides. He began to notice how his fear affected him physically. His hands trembled slightly when he touched control panels, his heart raced when he reviewed system diagnostics, and his mind seemed to jump from one worry to the next. He was not accustomed to leading, to making decisions with such high stakes. Machines had rules, but people were unpredictable, and the celestial Titan was a microcosm of human and technological complexity. One night, unable to sleep, Thomas wandered through the lower decks. The corridors were quiet, illuminated by soft, dim lights. The ship seemed almost alive in the stillness, its engines humming faintly beneath his feet. He imagined the ship traveling through the stars, its massive engines propelling it into the unknown. The thought both thrilled and terrified him. The celestial Titan was not just a ship, It was a symbol of human ambition, ingenuity, and exploration. And now it was his. As he walked, Thomas realized that the ship held more than just systems and crew. It held the legacy of his uncle, a man who had dedicated his life to pushing the boundaries of human knowledge. Every blueprint, every log, every artifact on board was a piece of that legacy. Thomas felt a deep connection to the man he had barely known, and he understood that taking command of the ship was not just about responsibility. It was about honoring a dream that had been decades in the making. The next morning, Thomas met with Alara and the ship's AI, Kai, a sophisticated program designed to assist with operations and decision-making. Kai had a calm, neutral voice, and it could access every system on the ship. Thomas was impressed by its capabilities, but also intimidated. He had worked with AI systems before, but none as advanced as Kai. Kai will assist you in managing the ship, Alara explained. It can handle routine operations, monitor systems, and provide guidance, but ultimately decisions are yours. Thomas nodded, feeling both relief and pressure. The AI could help, but it could not make him a leader. He would have to find that strength within himself. Over the following days, Thomas began to take small steps. He familiarized himself with the bridge, learned the basics of navigation and propulsion, and observed crew operations. He practiced giving instructions, communicating clearly, and making decisions under supervision. Each step was a challenge, but slowly he began to feel a sense of control. Yet the fear never fully disappeared. Thomas often paused in front of massive engine cores, blinking control panels, and endless corridors, feeling the immensity of his task. He realized that the celestial titan was not just a machine. It was a living, breathing entity in its own way, requiring attention, care, and understanding. The scale of responsibility was staggering, but he also felt a growing sense of purpose. He began to see the ship not as a burden, but as an opportunity to test his skills, to grow as a person, and to contribute to something far greater than himself. He realized that fear was natural, but it should not stop him. Every engineer, every explorer, every leader had faced moments of doubt. The difference lay in how they responded. By the end of the week, Thomas had taken his first real steps toward ownership. He walked the bridge confidently, interacted with the crew, and even ran simulations under Alara's supervision. The ship, vast and overwhelming as it was, began to feel familiar in small ways. The hum of engines, the blinking of lights, and the rhythm of daily operations became a part of his world. For the first time, Thomas allowed himself a moment of quiet pride. He was no longer just an engineer observing from afar. He was stepping into a role that would challenge every skill, every decision, and every ounce of courage he possessed. The celestial titan was no longer an abstract concept from a letter. It was real, tangible, and his to care for. And while fear still lingered, it was now mixed with something new, determination. Thomas knew that he had a long journey ahead, both through the stars and within himself, but he was ready to take the first steps. The ship awaited him, immense, silent, and magnificent. And Thomas Keller, the human engineer who had once lived a simple life on Earth, was beginning to find his place in a story far larger than he had ever imagined. The morning sun had not yet fully risen when Thomas Keller arrived at the massive docking bay. The air smelled faintly of ozone and machinery, the low hum of the station vibrating through the floor beneath his feet. Today was the day. Today, he would step onto the celestial titan as its master, not just as a visitor or observer. The thought sent a shiver down his spine. He had trained, studied, and walked the decks before, but now the reality of full responsibility loomed over him like a shadow. Alara met him at the base of the boarding ramp. Her face was calm, almost serene, but Thomas could see the subtle tension in her shoulders. She must have known what he was feeling. "Are you ready?" she asked. Thomas nodded, though his voice caught in his throat. "I think I'm ready." But as soon as the words left his lips, doubt flooded back. Ready? How could anyone be ready for this? He swallowed hard, feeling the weight of thousands of lives, of a ship the size of a small city, pressing down on him. The ramp stretched upward, wide enough for several people to walk side by side. It led into the docking bay doors, which opened slowly, revealing the interior of the ship. Thomas paused, staring at the immense space inside. Light reflected off polished metal floors, and corridors extended farther than he could see. Massive engines loomed in the distance, and every wall was lined with blinking panels and displays. It was magnificent and terrifying. The moment he set foot inside, something unexpected happened. Thomas froze. His legs felt heavy, like they were anchored to the floor. His mind, which had been buzzing with plans and knowledge, suddenly went blank. He was surrounded by a world larger than anything he had ever imagined, and the enormity of it paralyzed him. Alara stepped closer, her voice soft but firm. "Take a breath, one step at a time." Thomas nodded weakly, but he could barely move. Every corridor seemed infinite. Every control panel seemed too complex to touch. His hands, which had handled precise machinery all his life, trembled slightly. It was not fear in the usual sense. It was something deeper, a raw, primal response to the sheer scale of what he was facing. He had inherited a world, and he felt wholly unworthy. The crew, who had been watching from nearby decks, noticed his hesitation. Some whispered quietly, while others exchanged looks of concern. Thomas could feel their gaze like a physical weight. He realized then that leadership was not about knowledge alone. It was about courage, about standing firm when every instinct screamed to step back. Alara guided him slowly through the first deck. She pointed out critical systems, explaining their functions, but Thomas barely registered the words. His eyes kept drifting to the massive engine cores and the vast halls that stretched into shadows. Each step was an effort. He felt the immensity of the ship in every fiber of his being. It was alive, not in a mechanical sense, but as a presence. It demanded respect, attention, and courage. Kai, the AI, spoke gently through the overhead system. "Thomas Keller, please remember that you do not face this alone. Guidance is available, but the first steps must be yours." The voice was calm, neutral, but somehow it pierced his panic. Thomas swallowed and took a shaky step forward. Another followed. Slowly, he began to move through the corridors, guided by Alara and the soft prompts of Kai. His heart pounded and his thoughts raced. What if he failed? What if a small mistake caused a catastrophic problem? What if he could not rise to the expectations of those who depended on him? Despite the fear, there was a strange fascination as well. He began to notice details he had never appreciated before. The way light reflected off polished metal, the subtle hum of the engines, the patterns of blinking lights that seemed almost like a language. The ship was a marvel, a monument to human ingenuity, and he was a part of it. For a moment, he allowed himself to marvel, to feel awe instead of fear. As they reached the bridge, Thomas froze again. The bridge was vast, circular, and lined with banks of control panels. Large windows offered a view of the docking bay and the stars beyond. He could see the curvature of distant planets and the glow of station lights reflecting in the darkness. The reality of command hit him with full force. This was where decisions would be made, where mistakes could ripple through the ship and affect lives. Alara stepped aside, giving him space. "This is your station," she said. "You are the captain. The ship waits for your direction." Thomas took a deep breath, feeling the weight of responsibility settle heavily on his shoulders. For a long moment, he simply stood there, unable to speak or move. Every instinct told him to retreat, to find the safety of a simpler life, to avoid the challenge. But something inside him pushed back. The same curiosity and love for problem-solving that had made him a great engineer whispered that he could learn, that he could rise to the occasion if he took it step by step. He moved to the central console, running his hands over the familiar yet intimidating controls. Kai's voice guided him, providing information, answering questions, and explaining procedures. Slowly, Thomas began to feel a sense of control. It was small, tentative, but it was there. The first step had been taken, and he had survived it. The crew began to interact with him, reporting status updates and asking for instructions. Thomas felt the familiar tension of leadership pressing against him, but he also felt something else, a sense of purpose. He realized that being captain was not about knowing everything in advance. It was about listening, learning, and making decisions with the information available. It was about courage, not perfection. Hours passed as he walked the bridge, checked systems, and interacted with the crew. The initial panic had not disappeared entirely, but it had lessened. Thomas felt a strange pride in his ability to function under pressure, to face a situation far beyond anything he had imagined. He was no longer frozen in fear. He was learning to navigate it. That evening, Thomas stood alone on the observation deck, looking out at the docking bay. The station lights reflected on the polished metal surfaces, and he could see the massive engines of the celestial Titan resting silently. He felt a connection to the ship, as if it recognized his presence and his willingness to embrace the responsibility. The fear was still there, but it was tempered by wonder and determination. He thought about his uncle, Adrian Keller, and the life he had built. Every blueprint, every design, every artifact on board was a reflection of a man who had dared to dream beyond the limits of the ordinary. Thomas felt a deep sense of duty to honor that legacy, not just as an engineer, but as a leader. The next few days were a test of endurance and resolve. Thomas ran simulations with the crew, monitored systems, and practiced decision-making under guided supervision. Each exercise challenged him, forcing him to confront his fears and doubts. And each time he discovered a little more strength within himself. The celestial titan was no longer just an overwhelming presence. It was a teacher, guiding him toward understanding and capability. Despite the progress, Thomas knew he had far to go. The ship was vast, and every system, every corridor, every component held potential challenges. Leadership was not about completing a checklist. It was about constant awareness, adaptability, and courage. He spent hours walking through the decks alone, observing, learning, and reflecting. Each walk reinforced the reality of his role and the enormity of the task ahead. One night, as he sat in the quiet of the observation deck, Thomas realized something profound. Fear was not an enemy. It was a signal that he was stepping beyond the limits of what he had known, that he was confronting the unknown. Courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. And in that realization, Thomas found a new strength, fragile but real. The celestial titan awaited him, silent and vast, ready for the day when he would command it fully. Thomas Keller, the human engineer who had once lived a life of simple routines, was learning to face the most extraordinary challenge of his life. He was no longer frozen at the threshold. He was beginning to step into the role he had inherited, slowly, deliberately, and with growing confidence. As dawn broke over the station, casting pale light across the docking bay, Thomas stood at the edge of the observation deck. He looked at the ship, at the crew, and at the endless possibilities that lay ahead. Fear still lingered, but it was no longer paralyzing. He was beginning to understand that leadership was a journey, not a destination. And for the first time, Thomas felt ready to continue that journey, step by step, into the unknown. The ship was vast, the challenge immense, but Thomas Keller had begun to move forward. And in that first step, he had taken the most important step of all. He had begun to claim his place in the story of the celestial titan, a story that was larger than fear, larger than doubt, and larger than any single human being. The morning aboard the celestial titan was alive. With quiet anticipation, Thomas Keller had spent the past weeks learning the ship, its systems, and the crew, and yet the reality of full command still pressed heavily on him. Today was not a simulation. Today, he would officially assume the role of captain, and every decision, every command would carry real consequences. Thomas stood on the bridge, hands lightly resting on the polished rail of the central console. The room was vast, the windows showing the stars beyond the station, and the hum of the ship was almost musical, resonating through the floor and into his chest. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. The crew moved around him, performing last checks, adjusting controls, and glancing at him with a mixture of respect and expectation. Ilara approached, her expression calm but firm. "Are you ready, Thomas?" she asked. He nodded slowly. "I think I am," he said, though the words did not entirely mask the nervous tension in his voice. "Let's begin." Kai, the ship's AI, activated fully for the day. Its voice filled the bridge, calm and steady. "Captain Keller, all systems are operational. Crew is ready. The ship awaits your orders." Thomas looked around at the consoles, the blinking lights, and the vast expanse of the bridge. He felt the weight of responsibility settle on him like a heavy cloak, but he also felt something else, determination. He had spent weeks preparing for this moment, and now it was time to act. "Very well," he said, voice firmer than he expected. "Prepare for initial system check and propulsion test. I want a full report on all engine cores, life support systems, and navigation readiness." The crew responded efficiently, moving through their duties with practiced precision. Thomas watched, absorbing every detail, asking questions when necessary, and listening carefully. Each decision he made, each command he gave, reinforced a growing sense of authority within him. He was still nervous, but the fear that had once paralyzed him had begun to transform into focus. As the system check progressed, Thomas noticed a minor anomaly in the energy distribution network. It was subtle, easily overlooked, but he recognized the pattern immediately. Years of engineering experience allowed him to see what others might not. "Kai," he said, "I need a detailed readout on energy fluctuations in the secondary cores. Show me any irregularities." The AI responded instantly, projecting the data across the main display. Thomas studied the patterns, traced the cause to a misaligned conduit, and instructed the crew on corrective measures. Within minutes, the anomaly was resolved. A small victory, but an important one. It reminded him that despite the size of the ship and the enormity of the task, he could make a difference. He could take control. The rest of the day continued in a similar rhythm. Thomas issued commands, observed the crew, and made decisions with care and thoughtfulness. He consulted with Alara and Kai when necessary, but increasingly, he found himself relying on his own instincts and experience. The bridge that had once seemed intimidating now began to feel like a workspace he could navigate, a place where he could make decisions and see the immediate results of his actions. By afternoon, the time had come for the first propulsion test. Thomas stood at the central console, heart pounding with anticipation. The Celestial Titan's engines were immense, capable of propelling the ship across vast distances at speeds that humans had once only imagined. Today, he would see them in motion, and the weight of responsibility pressed heavier than ever. "Engage propulsion systems," he commanded, voice steady. The engines responded, humming to life with a deep, resonant sound that seemed to vibrate through every deck of the ship. Lights on the panels shifted, indicating energy flow, stability, and operational readiness. Thomas watched closely, monitoring every parameter, ensuring that every system functioned as expected. The test was successful. The engines performed flawlessly, and the ship responded precisely to commands. A sense of accomplishment washed over Thomas. He had taken control of a vessel larger than any city on Earth, a machine of impossible complexity, and had guided it through its first operational test under his command. The fear that had once frozen him was replaced with a growing sense of confidence. Yet the day was far from over. As the propulsion system settled, Thomas received a report from the environmental monitoring team. There had been a minor fluctuation in oxygen levels on one of the lower decks. It was nothing dangerous, but it required immediate attention. "Report," he said, moving quickly to review the data. Alara explained the situation. "A secondary air circulation system on Deck 42 is malfunctioning. It will not endanger the crew, but the system needs recalibration to prevent further issues." Thomas nodded. "I'll handle it." "Kai, guide me to the system controls and provide step-by-step instructions." The AI's voice responded instantly, and Thomas followed its guidance down the long corridors of the ship. The scale of the Celestial Titan made even a simple walk feel monumental. He passed through vast halls, observation decks, and maintenance shafts, each filled with the quiet hum of machinery and the subtle vibrations of the engines. The ship was alive in every sense, and he felt its presence around him. When he reached the secondary system controls, he studied the readings carefully. Following Kai's guidance and relying on his own technical knowledge, he began the recalibration process. Step by step, he adjusted circuits, monitored feedback loops, and stabilized the oxygen flow. The system responded smoothly, and Thomas felt a surge of pride. Not only had he solved a problem that could have grown serious, but he had also proven to himself that he was capable of managing the ship in real time. Returning to the bridge, Thomas felt a new sense of connection with the Celestial Titan. It was no longer just a massive, intimidating machine. It was a partner, a challenge, and a reflection of his own abilities. He understood that leadership was not about knowing everything at once, but about making thoughtful decisions, acting decisively when necessary, and learning constantly. The evening brought a quiet moment of reflection. Thomas walked alone on the observation deck, looking out at the stars beyond the station. The vastness of space stretched endlessly before him, and he felt both humbled and inspired. He thought of his uncle, Adrian Keller, and the legacy that had brought him to this moment. Every blueprint, every log, every piece of equipment on the ship was a testament to human ambition and ingenuity. And now, it was his turn to continue that legacy. He realized that the journey ahead would not be simple. The Celestial Titan was vast, and every system, every decision, and every crew member required attention and care. Mistakes could have serious consequences. But he also realized that fear was not the enemy. It was a guide, signaling that he was facing challenges beyond the ordinary. Courage, he understood now, was acting despite fear, and he had taken the first steps toward embracing it fully. In the following days, Thomas continued to grow into his role. He held meetings with crew leaders, discussed long-term operational plans, and worked closely with Alara to understand the nuances of command. He listened carefully, asked questions, and made decisions with thoughtfulness and care. Slowly, he earned the crew's confidence, not through authority alone, but through competence, humility, and courage. He began to understand that leadership was as much about listening as it was about acting. He learned the strengths and weaknesses of his crew, observed how systems interacted, and developed a rhythm that allowed him to manage the ship effectively. Every challenge he faced, from technical issues to crew concerns, became an opportunity to grow, to learn, and to prove to himself that he could rise to the task. One evening, Thomas gathered the crew on the main deck. The room was filled with engineers, navigators, technicians, and support staff. He felt the weight of expectation pressing on him, but he also felt a deep sense of connection with these people who would travel with him through the stars. "Today marks the beginning of a new chapter for all of us," he said, voice steady. "The Celestial Titan is more than a ship. It is our home, our responsibility, and our legacy. I know I am still learning, and I will not have all the answers. But I promise to lead with care, to listen, and to act with the best intentions. Together, we will face challenges, explore the unknown, and continue the work that brought us here." The crew listened in silence, then responded with nods and murmurs of agreement. Thomas felt a sense of pride and belonging he had never experienced before. He was no longer the frozen engineer at the edge of the ship. He was the captain, fully aware of the responsibility and ready to embrace it. As the days turned into weeks, Thomas continued to lead the Celestial Titan, facing technical challenges, crew management, and the constant pressure of responsibility. Each success, no matter how small, strengthened his confidence. Each mistake became a lesson, and each decision reinforced his connection to the ship and the crew. By the time the first scheduled departure from the docking station approached, Thomas was no longer afraid. He stood on the bridge, surrounded by the hum of engines, the blinking lights of control panels, and the presence of his crew. The Celestial Titan was ready, and so was he. With a deep breath, he issued the command. "Engage departure sequence. Prepare for voyage." The engines responded, powerful and precise, propelling the ship smoothly into the void of space. The stars stretched out before them, endless and inviting, and Thomas felt a profound sense of awe and fulfillment. He had inherited a ship larger than any imagination could hold, faced the paralyzing fear of responsibility, and grown into the role he had been chosen for. As the Celestial Titan glided into the unknown, Thomas Keller stood at the central console, heart steady, mind focused, and spirit ready. He knew challenges awaited, but he also knew that he was capable. He was no longer just an engineer. He was a captain, a leader, and the steward of humanity's greatest achievement. The ship, vast and magnificent, hummed beneath his feet. The stars stretched endlessly ahead. And Thomas Keller, once frozen by fear, now moved forward with courage, determination, and the knowledge that he was exactly where he was meant to be.